Everybody, my name is Claire Beresford. I am the CEO of Lawrence Simons. Welcome to the latest edition of Summing Up. This is the podcast where we explore the biggest and most pressing issues that the legal industry is tackling in these very challenging times with some incredible leaders, and none more so than our guest today. I'm delighted to welcome the wonderful Greer McMullen. Grierson is the General Counsel and Company Secretary at LGC, a leading global life sciences tools company, providing mission-critical components and solutions across human healthcare. Previously, Greer was the General Counsel at global beauty company Coty Inc. and manufacturing SWM International. Greer has more than 25 years of legal leadership experience, serving in senior legal positions for several US public companies, and with an incredibly diverse career spanning M&A, negotiation, litigation management, legal compliance for both developed and emerging markets. It's wonderful to welcome him here with us today. Welcome, Greer.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, if I may, can I start, I suppose, right at the very beginning? With your childhood, really. Did you always want to be a lawyer?
No, I actually didn't want to be a lawyer deliberately. I wanted to be an underwater archaeologist, but slightly different direction. And obviously that did not come to be.
What was the interest in underwater archaeology? Were you a curious child, I'm assuming?
I think it's a combination of the concept of scuba diving with treasure hunting. So as a 10 or 11-year-old, I think those two things are fairly irresistible.
Did you grow up near to the coast?
No, I grew up in England, Ireland, and France. Not far from the coast, but certainly not on the beach or anything like that.
Fantastic. So when did the choice or the burning desire to enter into the legal profession, when did that happen for you?
That actually probably happened at the end of law school. So not at the beginning of law school. I'd finished undergrad in the US at Georgetown. I'd taken a year off, a gap year, mainly to explore fencing. And my grandfather had said, if you don't really know what you want to do, why don't you go to law school? It's a great general education, and you could do a lot worse. So I went to law school, and it was really toward the end of law school that I started to develop a passion for the law, but more so really the intersection of law and business, the bridging that gap, facilitating communication and alignment is what I developed a passion about.
Fantastic. So you finished law school. What was the next step for you?
Next step was I clerked for a U.S. federal appellate judge. And it was a very hard working year. So we got 3 hours off on a Sunday, was our time off. And I learned two things from him. And these are a little bit of life lessons for me. First is one of the few things in life that no one can ever take away from you is your integrity. That's something you have to give up. And so that's something you have control over. And once you give it up, you can never really get it back, because in the law, integrity also equals credibility. And our stock and trade is the spoken word. If our spoken word is not believed or is not credited, and then we have basically no value as a lawyer. The other lesson I learned was do what you believe. So a little anecdote, my judge had us research cases and write the draft opinions. So one of my first activities was he told me to write an opinion. Being a brand new lawyer, not knowing much, I probably didn't understand him well. So I wrote something that I thought I heard, but made no sense to me. But I said, he's the judge. This is what I understood. I'm going to write it this way. I gave him the opinion. He then called me into his chambers and said, Greer, why the heck? Well, he didn't use the word heck, but why the heck did you write the opinion this way? It makes no sense. And the one thing I couldn't say to him was, well, Judge, you told me to write it that way. So then I started to defend something I didn't believe. And that's the most awkward feeling you can have. So if you're going to go down in flames, at least go down in flames for something you believe in.
I totally agree. Look, I think that's very sage advice, and probably one that has served you well throughout your career, I would imagine. So you finished the clerkship. What did that open up in terms of your next career step?
So I joined a U.S. law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Was in the D.C. and then the Paris offices for a few years, and then eventually, with a stop or two in between, ended up at General Electric in the U.S. for 7 years, in several different divisions, and that's where, in my view, I really learned how to be an in-house lawyer. Some very key tenets. And then I was fortunate enough when I left GE to become General Counsel of a U.S. public company, which has kind of been my career path since, except for today.
That's interesting. The transition from private practice when you were at Sullivan and Cromwell and then into GE. Why did you make that? Why did you make that leap? What was the choice that was around moving from private practice into an in-house role?
Several. One is when you're in private practice, you don't get to see the results of your work, really. You get engaged for a transaction for a particular matter, then they don't want to pay you anymore, so you then work for somebody else and you kind of rotate. And you don't really get to live with your successes or your mistakes. And when you learn a client, you need to learn them deeply, but you then may have to learn a different client 2 months later. So you get a feeling that your sweat equity is a bit wasted. So working in-house for a particular company allows two things. It allows you to really get to know the company, form relationships, and then it also allows you to see what works and doesn't work because you hang around there. And that allows your growth and development as a lawyer. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, that I think is very interesting about being in-house, and I'm biased, my apologies, I think business is very interesting and in a way offers more creative opportunities than the law. So the idea of blending the law, which in some areas is immutable, with business, which is changeable and dynamic, I think can tax the skill set and the intellect in ways that just being in private practice may not.
That's, I think, the wonder of a general counsel role, right? That ability, as you say, to understand what the risk profile from that legal perspective or the compliance perspective against what the business is seeking to achieve, and how can you enable that? That's very, I think, apt in terms then of making that leap that you made into in-house, and then as your career developed up that career ladder into those significant chief legal officer, general counsel roles. You mentioned earlier just about sort of some things that you learned when you were doing your clerkship, some sage pieces of advice. And one of the things we always try to do when we're speaking to senior leaders, such as yourself, is advice that they would give to maybe themselves starting out, or to younger lawyers. What are your words of wisdom for some of the more junior and not quite yet at the top of the tree lawyers that may be listening or watching this?
Lots of advice, a lot of which I did not follow when I was younger. You never know as much as you think you know. And the longer you get in your career, the more you know that you don't know, which is helpful because that then teaches a trait of listening and learning and listening with an open mind. So as a young lawyer, I would advise focusing on self-development, learning, with an understanding there's a lot more out there that you don't know than what you do know. The other piece of advice I would give is try to figure out what you want to achieve with your career relatively early on, if you can. And then you can map out different options and different ways of achieving your goal, as opposed to drifting. And sometimes not in-house, in private practice, it can be a tough career, and sometimes people are not fans of it, but they don't really know what they want to do instead. If you want to go in-house, there are a lot of things one can do to prepare to go in-house, to form networks, contacts, get mentors that then allow you to go in-house. But part of it may be that you need the contacts and mentors to understand what being in-house is, and is the grass really greener? I happen to think it is based on my choices, but for many people it won't be greener. And having a realistic assessment of what you want to achieve as early as you can, I think would then be beneficial because you can then develop a roadmap to achieve it.
Very sensible. Yeah, great advice. Great advice. And I think that you touched then on sort of having that roadmap, understanding what it is that you're seeking to achieve. What are those career choices? Obviously, we at Lawrence Simons are in the business of helping companies, find and acquire that talent. And I think it's interesting sometimes that when we are doing what we do in asking some of those searching questions to the talent that we're looking at for companies and for law firms, that when you scratch some of that, sometimes it isn't there. So I know that you are very rigorous in how you hire and what you look for in talent. Could you also share with our audience what advice you would have for hiring managers?
I feel somewhat passionate about this, and I sometimes have very dynamic and constructive conversations with HR on this. So I think the most important activity a manager can do is to hire well. If you hire well, then it's very easy to manage that person or lead that person, and it's very easy to lead a function if it's staffed with stars. If it's not staffed with stars, then it's much harder to lead the function and much harder to have a high-performing function. So therefore, making sure you make every effort to hire stars, I think, is critical. So one of the things I think you should do is develop criteria. What are you looking for? It's not who you like, because you're not hiring to have a beer with somebody. You're hiring for them to be effective in the job. And so, in my opinion, you develop criteria. They're 80% of them are objective criteria. Of course, there has to be some fit, but mostly it's objective. And then I believe in it being a team sport. I'm going to have one way of looking at talent. HR, my peers, or my team members may have additional ways of looking at talent. And I don't want to have it just be my lens, because not only will I bring inherent biases to the process, but I'm only one person. So I very much value as much input from as many other people as I possibly can get. The other thing, though, at the end of the day, if you're the hiring manager, you have to have confidence in your hire. And I spend time with the individual that I'm hiring or the leading candidates in order to really understand how they practice law and what makes them tick. So the resume for me gets them to the meeting, but I don't hire the resume, I hire the person. And you have to spend enough time to actually get to know that person. And actually, I'm looking for perhaps things that are not typical. I'm looking for someone who will argue with me, because I want my direct report to tell me about my mistakes before I make them, not after I make them. And if that person doesn't feel comfortable arguing with me, then they may not tell me ahead of time that I'm about to do something silly. So I look for, not only legal traits, but personality traits, confidence, ability to think on feet, as well as the ability to push back on me. But fundamentally, my bottom line advice to a hiring manager is do your best to hire the best person who will basically potentially save your career. As a general counsel, I give about 2% of the legal advice to any given company, maybe less. 98% come from other people. So if I do a great job as a lawyer myself as an individual, but don't hire a good team, 98% of the advice is not good, and I'm a failure as a general counsel. So in a way, it's almost more important for me to be a good hiring manager than it is for me to be a good individual lawyer. I would like to think I'm good at both, but but if you look at your time allocation, it's really important to have a good team, because it's that team that's going to provide the bulk of the advice to your client, which is the company.
It's really interesting, Greer, that you were saying that you want somebody in that interview process to be able to debate with you or to be able to push back. And I think it is true that goes to the confidence of the individual. It is not necessarily what candidates, when they're going to meet ultimately who their boss is going to be and be part of a team, it's not necessarily the default that somebody would go in. So how are you able to uncover that without it being a sort of a, a proper full-on, tit for tat sort of debate? Do you have ways of being able to uncover that sort of that spark that you could see it rather than it being something that they would do in interview?
So it depends on the level of the person you're hiring. So I'm talking about direct reports for me. If it's a junior lawyer, my expectations will be different. But if it's a direct report to me, and I'm going to maybe give an unconventional answer, I'm not actually trying to help them too much to get there. I want them to get there on their own, because if I'm absent and they have to argue with the CEO may not take a lot of time to massage their ego or make them feel comfortable. In fact, they may have to barge into the CEO's office and say, "Stop! Don't do that." And so the way I get into it is I will talk about the substantive legal area that they're being hired for. And I'll come up with legal scenarios and legal questions that may have a right or wrong answer, but may not. It may be shades of gray. And I'll want to see how they discuss it with me. Do they just accept everything I say? It may feel nice for me for 30 seconds, but then I know I'm in trouble. Or are they going to say, well, Greer, there's another way of thinking about it. What about this? And so that's kind of what I'm looking for. And I try to obviously come across as not unfriendly, but if it's a senior hire, they need to have that skill for the meeting. I'm kind of testing, do they have it? I'm not trying to be their mentor in that interview. I'm trying to, if it's a senior hire, I'm hoping they have it with them. And that's what I'm trying to find out.
And I think that makes particular sense when you're saying that, in your absence, who's going to be your proxy in those real discussions at that board level, to be able to go toe to toe with the CEO or the CFO or whomever those C-suite are, to be able to ensure that actually the business outcome is the right one. It goes back to what you were talking about right at the beginning in terms of integrity. And that sort of arc of that coming through. I think that's really valuable advice to hiring managers. Thank you. If I may, I'd just like to change gears a little bit. And you mentioned actually, just in passing, about sort of diversity of thought, right? Diversity of being able to look in your team and see that you've got people that are, fit for the role that they've been hired into, but getting that combination of a high-performing team. So we know that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a hot topic for the legal industry and other sectors as well. It's not just legal that's facing this. What I am very curious to understand is, as a woman and as a CEO, is how we can ensure that when we're talking about DE&I, we have male allyship. That we are, when we are having these themes, that it isn't just an echo chamber of women in a room saying all of these things. So, how important is male allyship in our industry?
It's a very hard question to ask because I'm a male. So to say it's very important feels somehow like self-serving. I do think it has an important role, though. An example I will give you is, I'll talk to a Magic Circle firm about D&I, and the D&I partners will come visit me, and they're typically women. And I say very nicely, I don't want to see you. And they say, why not? I said, because you're not the problem. And if I say something to you, you're going to go back to the firm and say, this is what a GC of X company said. And secretly, the men are going to think, well, of course they're going to say that. Of course, the man's going to say that to them because that's their role. And it's going to feel like it will be discounted. So what I say to the D&I partners, and they've almost always been female, is send me the most difficult fuddy-duddy male that you secretly think is the biggest problem. And let me have a conversation with him. And that happens. I get that. And then I have a real conversation. And there's no, if you will, political correctness about it. I'm very blunt. It is just simply, here's what has to happen. Here's where I think the firm is falling short. Here's what the firm can do better, in my opinion. Here's why it's so important. I have negotiated preferred counsel arrangements with Magic Circle firms that actually have money tied to the diversity of the team that they staff my matters with. Either it relates to a gift to charity, or they will sponsor a diverse intern. And so to put a bit of teeth behind it, I mean, not huge teeth, but reasonable teeth. But I think a man in some ways is able to have a conversation that can be impactful in a different way with another man who may not quite get it fully.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's an important voice.
It is a really important voice, and I think it's also a missing voice, right? I think there's a sense that because potentially a lot of it, I can't speak for all people, but I am going to generalize here. But I think when I'm speaking to leaders about this, male leaders about this, they don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to tread on toes in that way. And so I think that there is a sense of, well, I won't say anything. It's probably best if I don't say anything. And I think you've hit the nail on the head when you're saying that men have to use their voices, right? And there is a real call, I think, for the point that you made, man to man, speaking to that fuddy-duddy partner at that Magic Circle law firm, going, this is what I need, and here are the reasons why. So, you're one of a group of male leaders who kind of get it, if I could put it that way. What else can we be doing? What else can we be doing as an industry to ensure that that allyship has momentum?
So I'm not an expert at it, so I'm going to maybe have a couple of ideas, but I'm not going to pretend like this is advice for an industry or anything. As a male, I think it's really important to listen and create space for other voices to be heard, which I think generally is the right answer anyway. As a leader, I don't think you should speak first. I think you should tend to speak last. But because I've never been a professional female, how do I know what that experience is really like? And I can be told what it's like, but then for me to then say, oh, I have the answer for it, I think is a bit arrogant and, to be honest, not accurate. So I think what we can do is we can create the space for other voices to be heard and for other solutions to be put forward that actually make sense. And one of the reasons for that is I'm also of a certain generation. A lot of the answers actually on this issue, I think, lie with younger generations. And so and the younger generations sometimes have a voice that's harder to be heard, not all the time, but sometimes in a hierarchy or in a company. And so creating the space for those younger voices to be heard who will often think about things from a completely different angle, I think is important. And so the male role in that case would be to create space, create a bit of safety, if you will, where other ideas and thoughts can be explored, and do one's best not to be threatened by change or feel threatened by change or new ideas, but instead to take it as an opportunity to learn and self-develop.
I think it's interesting that point of change. I've started to use the word evolution because I think it can be less threatening to people that we're on this evolution, just as International Women's Day has sort of become a marked thing in the calendar. One thing that we're seeking to do is to have that equal sort of momentum around International Men's Day, which is coming up this month on the 19th of November. And I feel very strongly that, to the point that you're making about having some of those conversations, we have seen improvements within the legal profession about how some of these difficult conversations are being had. I'm just curious to understand if you have a viewpoint in terms of mental well-being and mental health. We know that these past few years for lawyers have been very difficult. They had to get through Brexit, COVID. We're now in an economic downturn. Do you have any particular things that you're doing in companies that you've worked with or in associations that you're in that are helping mental health, and particularly mental health within the male profession?
I don't actually very much distinguish between the genders in my approach. And so the thing that I do that may be slightly different, I mean, it's not a lot of people are going to do what I'm going to say, but it's something that I'm particularly focused on beyond the normal stuff about one-to-one meetings, skip level meetings, and staff meetings, and getting together in person when you can as a group. But I've gone through a total 180 flip. I used to believe that working in the office was very important. And I've now don't require anybody to come into the office. I encourage people to come in 1 or 2 days a week, partly for their mental health, because if you're alone at home the whole time. But if you require people to come in 3 or 4 days a week, that puts a burden, I think, on them and creates stress on them. They may have home responsibilities. I have one direct report. He picks his children from school every day at 4. If he had to be in the office every day, he couldn't do that. So what I tend to measure is output, but not where the work is done. And if someone wants to come into the office 5 days a week, that's fine. It's their choice. If they don't want to come in, that's also fine. And I've got a little bit of flack for that from some team members, because some team members have a different muscle memory, and they think if you're not in the office, you're not working, and it's your duty to be in the office. My view is if you have to be in the office to get good work done, you're probably not the right team member that I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who is a self-starter and who has good output, and that person can choose where they're the most efficient. If someone wants to take 3 hours off in the middle of the day and work a bit in the evening, or they're just very efficient and they shut it down at 5, I don't care. That's up to them. I think if you do that, and you follow it up with regular touch bases, I think that reduces mental stress and therefore enables a better mental well-being. Understanding, of course, that in this day and age, mental well-being is so much more than just where you work, right? You could have family members who are sick, and there's all kinds of other things that can happen. But my approach is to try to create space for the individual to sort out what they need at that particular time in their life. And obviously that may change over time.
That's really interesting that you've adopted that policy, and that you've also kind of had that 180 degrees flip on it. Are you seeing, and obviously your team, your direct reports are, as you say, sort of more senior in the organisation. One of the things that we're sort of unpicking at the moment is that junior lawyer sort of requirement, because we are of a generation where it was 5 days a week, and you had that osmosis effect of being in the office where you were picking up some of the other skills that you need as a lawyer. Are you having any insight into what your team members are saying about being in the office?
I wouldn't call it insight. I do think that it's a bit more of a challenge for my direct reports to manage more junior lawyers in some ways than it is for me to manage my direct reports. Because I think the younger generations have different perspectives that we have to listen to and understand. And they have different things that motivate them. And and they haven't, as you've said, kind of gone through yet the in-office formation or training. That is a common reference point to the older generation. And then also my direct reports, just because they're less senior, might have a little bit less experience managing. So I may be working with them on enhancing their managerial expertise. So I do think it is more delicate. Do I have any real guidance on that? I would say listening is really, really important. So try to check preconceived notions at the door, um, and listen to the younger generation and try to understand where they're coming from. But listening also doesn't mean abdicating. There is training that has to happen. There are kind of company cultural issues. There are norms, if you will, that are still relevant. And if someone hasn't been trained in them, then they need to be trained in them. And so I think there's a balance to be achieved. And it's not the balance necessarily that I grew up with. So I'm not suggesting there's one way to balance it and there's only one way. But I do think there is a balance. And then my final observation would be that balance may vary by individual. So as a manager, I don't approach personally managing each direct report the same way. I try to understand that person a bit to see what is more user friendly for that person. What can I do to help that person? And that may be different from one direct report to the other. And I encourage my direct reports to take the same approach.
The wisdom of listening is always a wise one to adhere to. So you've had such a, not that it's by any means over, Greer, but you've had such a fascinating career. And you're currently at LGC as the General Counsel and Company Secretary. Without sort of going into the minutiae of company confidential information, what do you do in that role? What have you learnt in this role? What have you brought from previous experiences that is helping you in your current role?
So, as you mentioned, I'm General Counsel, Company Secretary. I'm also Chief Compliance Officer and the Head of Risk. So there are a number of different hats. Um, what I'm actually, one of the things I've learned, which is maybe awful to say, well, not awful to say, but embarrassing to say, is again how much I don't know. So life sciences, particularly life sciences during COVID, is a brave new world for me. I did not have a life science background. I don't have a medical background or biology background or chemistry background. And life science tools is all about chemistry and biology. So you come in as what you think is a fairly experienced lawyer, thinking that you kind of know what you're doing to some degree. And you realize, again, there's so much you don't know. And to do a good job as a general counsel, you have to understand the business. And so if they speak a wholly different language, it is humbling. And you can't become a PhD chemist or PhD biologist overnight, or ever, actually, as it turns out. Once you're at my stage. So again, you have to find a way to balance adding value, because obviously you come to a company to add value, but you also have to spend a lot of time listening and learning and kind of resetting your roots a little bit, taking a little bit of a step back. And an important lesson that I continuously relearn, which I would urge on others, is the importance of relationships. So if you join a company in a sector that is new to you, which is what I did with LGC, how am I really going to learn? Am I going to pull out a biology book? Not really. I'm going to rely on colleagues. I'm going to rely on people who want to help me learn. And so spending time developing those relationships. So that's something I kind of knew already, but coming to LGC really reinforced it because I kind of had no choice. Otherwise, I could not learn the business. And without learning the business, I could not be effective in my role. And then just for the record, I'm not claiming I understand the business yet fully. I'm still on that journey.
That to me is a sign of a great leader, right? Somebody that has the confidence, but is also competent enough. And you said this right at the beginning around, the more experienced you become in your career, the more that you realize that you don't know as much as you think you do. So I think that is to me a sign of a leader who's understanding, okay, let me access what I need to know. Who do I need to go and ask this question of? Because I don't have the answer to that. Being able to work that matrices within an organisation, I think, is a great quality that general counsels have to have, and have to understand. Again, without sort of giving out any company information that I don't know, but are there any exciting projects? Are there any things that are coming up where you're like, wow, that is going to be a great thing for me, personally, or the company professionally? That is something that you think is again a learning opportunity that we can all have at whatever stage of our career.
There's nothing in particular I'd call out other than learning the business, which I've talked about, and trying to learn a bit about the technology. A project that was very interesting to me is during the pandemic, we negotiated a significant contract with the NHS to help with PCR testing. And doing that in the middle of the pandemic had to be done urgently. It was very, very complicated. It was my first experience negotiating with the NHS. So that was very, very interesting to me. It was rewarding because you felt not only were you doing a good job legally, hopefully, but you're also helping other people, or doing something that would lead to other people being helped. And so on our purpose is science for a safer world. So it makes a difference if you're working with a company that, this is very silly to say, but doing good, if you will. Um, that is, it makes some of those tough days a little bit less tough.
Isn't it interesting? I think that one of the things that's come out of that pandemic, our lived experience as a globe, is that I think there is a realization that living with purpose, or doing good, or having that contribution, is something I think that lawyers in particular have really always understood. I think that their work is a net, going right back to what you're saying about that integrity, right? There's a net positive to what lawyers contribute. It's not necessarily understood across all departments or all parts of society, but I think that's a lovely way to come towards the end of our podcast. What we do is we always ask one question, which is just a fun thing for us to learn a little bit about our guests, and that question is, what's the one thing you can't live without?
So, I mean, I'd give what I think is probably the obvious answer, and then I'll give a different answer. But the obvious answer is true, and that's family. And, the children, if one is of the age to have children, is really one's legacy to the world. And my children are at the age where they're fortunately finished uni. And that's kind of when you see the result of your parenting, because they're independent adults now. And that's kind of, what's been produced. But you never stop being a parent, but your relationship changes with them over time. And that evolution for me is very exciting and very rewarding, because you can, to some degree, become friends with your children as they're adults. It's difficult to be friends with your children before they're adults because you're the parent, and sometimes there can be some guidance or things you have to correct as a parent. But when they're adults, they are who they are, and you may have moral authority, but that's all you have. And to actually have them come to you for advice, not because they have to, but because they want to, and to go on journeys with them as they sort through issues, I think would be very hard to live without. But I think that's true for probably most everybody you speak to. The one thing that may be slightly different is that I've historically been a big fencer, and that to me is a passion of mine. I consider it physical chess. So it's very strategic, which is kind of what the law is. But then your body has to execute what your mind wants it to do in maybe a split second, and the other person is trying to do the same thing, and you're trying to outsmart the other person or double bluff them. They're trying to do the same to you, and it's a combination of kind of, if you think about it, a courtroom debate, at the same time that physically you have to actually do what you say and do it quickly. And so for me, that's a passion, and it's for me a very good stress reliever.
You mentioned right at the beginning that you had did you do a year? You said you had a gap year of fencing. So were you doing that sort of professionally, or what was that about? I'm just genuinely curious.
So I tried to make the U.S. Olympic team that year. I did not make it, but it was my aspiration to try to make it, and so I spent a good portion of that year trying to make it, and so.
Clearly, no slouch then. If you're able to compete at that level, even to make the team, I understand now why this is a passion and something clearly that you've had throughout your entire sort of adult life.
Right, and then I had to stop and go to law school. So that was my, the time to kind of be youthful, and then real life arrived on the scene.
Wonderful. Greer, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insight and words of wisdom with our audience. It's been our absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Well, likewise. Thank you so much.